love to try out new crafty tools, and I realized recently that I have not one, not two, not three, but 4 different stamp positioners. I'll show you my favorite uses for each one, then we can do a comparison. Let's start with the OM, the original Misti. This is actually the 2.0 version in black, with stronger hinges and a little parking spot for a magnet, and with a waffle flower grip mat instead of a mouse pad, but it's still the original size, 8.5 by 6.5 inches. One of my favorite things to do with this tool is to use the corner and turn a square piece of cardstock to create a pattern. I've done a little measuring and my cardstock is 5.5 inches by 5.5 inches, and I'm using this little stamp set from Altenew that has the pieces to make a granny square. I started by placing this square outline piece in the bottom corner of my cardstock, and then I stamped it with sangria ink, which is a deep reddish purple. I turned the cardstock 90 degrees and then stamped again, this time with Rouge. I turned again, this time stamped with Mandarin spice, and again, and this time with sauna. Okay, so the start of 4 granny squares, but there's still a lot of white space, right? I lifted the stamp and I moved it, so now it's in between the 2 previous squares. Now I can stamp and turn 4 more times to fill in my afghan. I'm using Skylight and Daydream to complete what I'm calling my cozy rainbow. These are from the Spa collection of Catherine Pooler inks, and they're a little more muted than my normal bright rainbow. Once I've turned the cardstock and filled in those 4 squares, I cleaned the stamp and used the acetate backer sheet to help me position it in the center to complete the pattern. Then I continued to fill in the granny squares with the next inner stamp, using the same turning techniques and rotating through my colors. Now, is this easier than just trying to eyeball the stamp and stamp it with an acrylic block? I mean, that is totally possible, and you absolutely do not need a Misti to create this pattern. But I do find this easier. Once I've got each stamp lined up, I get 4 impressions done before I have to line up the next one. I don't crochet, but I love the look of granny squares. I was really excited when I found this little stamp set. You could make solid colored granny squares, but where's the fun in that? Actually, I think it could be fun to do a tone-on-tone monochrome background just to give the look of that texture. And you can certainly change up the colors. Soft pastels would make super cute baby cards, and blues or greens and reds would work well for Christmas. I continued to work through the inner portions of my granny squares, turning each one 4 times on the corners, then moving it into the middle square before turning 4 times, and finally to the center of the cardstock. I made sure that each one of my granny squares had 4 colors in it, but as I say, there are so many options for colors when you're making a design like this. You can do this 4-turning method with the stamp wheel. It's got a corner, which makes it easy to be sure that your cardstock is in the correct position. You can also do it with the Sizzix platform, but there's no corners on that tool, so you'll need to use the grid mat to make sure that the corner of your cardstock is always in the right position. When I finally got to the end, I liked it, but I wanted to warm it up a little bit more, so I grabbed my buttercream ink and I swinked it all over. If you don't know about swinking, it's just a made-up word from Laurel that's swiping an ink pad direct to paper. It looks pretty yellow here, but as it dries, you'll see that it takes my background cardstock from pure white to a more creamy color. Okay, let's move on to the stamp wheel. The stamp wheel is about 9 by 9 inches, and let's compare it to the Misti. Here's the original. You can see it's a little longer but narrower, so it doesn't take up much more space. The stamp wheel doesn't have a hinge. It has a wheel which you lift right up out of the base. I've added numbers to the petals on the wheel, and I've color-coded them so I've got 4 of each to help with counting when I'm turning. The unique feature that only this stamp positioner has is its ability to turn your stamps to specific angles. You can use this to create circular designs like wreaths, and you can use it to make layering stamps more efficient. You can also use it really successfully with turnabout stamps. Now I'm going to build a granny circle with my granny square stamps. I started with the smallest center piece and I stamped that in red right in the center of the wheel. And then I stamped that next part of the square around the red in Mandarin spice. And after that, I kind of had to design the rest myself, and I started by using the single center piece and the sauna ink around what I had already stamped. I'm using 8 turns for this, so that means I'm turning my wheel to the odd numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, and 15. And I'm putting that numbered petal down in the bottom center, which is where I find it easiest to work from. I used the printed acetate backer sheet to help me decide what the next piece of my design would be, and I also used it to help me with positioning around the outside of what I'd already done. I stamped my next outer circle with Skylight, and then I went back to that small piece and I filled in the centers of those with Daydream. Now, could you do this with a Misti or the Sizzix positioner? I think the answer is yes, especially if you use something like the Gina K Wreath Builder to help you get precise angles for your turning. Next is my Sizzix Stamp and Stencil Positioner. This one is large. It has no corners, and the door can come out and be repositioned, which I think is the most unique feature of this tool. I started by putting a piece of paper on the replaceable sticky paper that comes with this tool. Then I placed my stamp in the bottom right corner, and I picked it up with the door. I stamped it down with my Rouge ink, and then I cleaned the stamp. Next, I pulled the door out of the edge mechanism, and I moved it to the next insert. Then I inked it up with Mandarin Spice and stamped it down. I cleaned the stamp, moved the lid, and stamped again with Sauna. Now, one thing that's always an issue when I use this tool is the size. You need to clear a lot of space to the left, in my case, where that door is opening. Also, as I move the door up further and further, eventually I'm hitting the stuff that's at the top of my desk, so I'll move the whole thing down so you can see it a little bit better. When I finished the first row, I moved the door back down to the original position, and I moved the cardstock over to the right. I added the center stamp so that I could fill in the first row while I was stamping the second row. I hope that's clear in the video how I'm doing that, because it's kind of hard to explain. Now, you can absolutely do this in the Misti. Of course, you can't move the door, but you can move your cardstock. You can have the cardstock hanging out of the Misti over the edges as well. This tool gives you absolutely precise movement because the door inserts are precisely certain amounts of space apart, which obviously the Misti doesn't have. But that also has pros and cons. With the Misti, you could move it a 1/4 inch or however much you want, but your precision is going to be more reliant on your ability to get your cardstock in the exact place that you want it. Because of the edges of the stamp wheel, you can't have your cardstock hanging out over the edge like you can with a Misti, so your ability to move your cardstock panel will be limited to the 7.5 inches of the base. And of course, all three of these tools can be used to stamp your sentiment, but honestly, that's when I pull out my mini Misti. It's small and it works really well when you're stamping something smaller than a card front size that you don't need to move or spin. I'm finishing all three of my cards with stamped sentiment panels using these solid greetings from Ink Blot Shop. I love this bold, simple font, and I'm mixing and matching from the regular and the giant sets for these two. I also die cut a couple of small hearts to add to the panels, and I'm using my new glue press to attach them. I'm still in the very beginning stages of trying this tool out, and I'll be back with my thoughts on this once I've had a chance to really determine what I think of it. So now let's compare the tools while I show you the cards. First, let's talk about cost. I'm including a waffle flower grip mat in the cost of the Mistis because I think that really makes it more comparable in features to the stamp wheel. And I just like the stickiness of that mat holding my cardstock without a magnet, but of course you can use just what comes with the Misti if you prefer. The Sizzix tool comes with a number of paper sticky sheets, but eventually they'll lose their stick and they'll need to be replaced, so that's an additional ongoing cost to keep in mind. Now let's talk about the size. I'd say that the Misti and the stamp wheel are comparable, although from a storage point of view, I store my Misti vertically, and you can't really do that with the stamp wheel because of the pedals on the wheel, so it's in a drawer. The Sizzix tool is significantly bigger, and as it showed, that can come with challenges, but it can also give you more flexibility in the size of your projects. And of course, the mini Misti is the smallest. Now features. All of the tools stamp and allow for perfectly positioned re-stamping and repeat stamping if you're making multiples. They all work with both clear and cling stamps, and they all stay put on your surface without sliding around. They all allow for some shifting when you're stamping, either by moving the paper or the door or the wheel. And as noted, the Sizzix tool and the Misti have more flexibility in this than the stamp wheel and the mini Misti. You can spin your cardstock in all of the tools to build patterns or wreaths. You may want to add a wreath builder tool to the Misti or Sizzix tool if you want more precision in your turning. For something like a turnabout stamp, again, all the tools will do that. With the Misti and the Sizzix tool, you have to move the cardstock, and you may want to use the Concord and 9th jig to help get precision with that. With the stamp wheel, once you've got the stamp centered properly on the wheel, you then move the wheel rather than the cardstock to complete the pattern, and it'll be perfect. So which one's right for you? I may not be the right person to ask, since I love all of them and I reach for each one at different times. But I hope this comparison has been useful for helping you decide. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.